The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were fixed on the small figure standing at the witness stand, a 12-year-old boy, his voice trembling but clear as he uttered the words that would echo through the room. "The cops beat me." His words hung in the air, sharp and unshakable, cutting through the tension like a knife. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the judge, usually so composed, seemed to freeze for a moment, his pen hovering above the paper as if unsure whether to write down what had just been said. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance, and his words carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. But what no one knew, what no one could have possibly anticipated, was that this was only the beginning. The real shock was still to come, and it would arrive just minutes later, turning the entire case on its head. The story begins in a small, quiet town where everyone knows everyone, and life moves at a pace that feels almost timeless. It's the kind of place where kids ride their bikes down empty streets, where neighbors wave to each other from their porches, and where the police are seen as protectors, not threats. But for 12-year-old Marcus Johnson, that image was shattered one fateful afternoon. Marcus was just like any other kid, curious, a little mischievous, and full of energy. He loved basketball, video games, and hanging out with his friends after school. But on that day, everything changed. What started as a routine walk home turned into a nightmare that would leave the entire town questioning everything they thought they knew. It was around 4 p.m. when Marcus was stopped by 2 police officers near the park. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just cutting through the park to get home faster. But the officers saw something suspicious, or at least that's what they claimed. What happened next is still a matter of debate, but one thing is certain. Marcus ended up in the hospital with bruises, a broken arm, and a story that no one wanted to believe. His mother, a single mom working 2 jobs to make ends meet, was furious. She demanded answers, but the police department stood by their officers, insisting that Marcus had resisted arrest and that they had acted within their rights. The town was divided. Some believed Marcus and his mother, while others sided with the police, convinced that the boy must have done something to provoke them. The case quickly gained attention, not just in the town, but across the state. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere. Social media, TV, even national news. People were outraged, demanding justice for Marcus. Protests erupted, with crowds chanting his name and calling for the officers to be held accountable. But the police department held firm, refusing to back down. And so the case went to court, where Marcus would have to tell his story in front of a judge, a jury, and the entire world. That brings us back to the courtroom, where Marcus's words, "The cops beat me," had just silenced everyone. His mother sat in the front row, her hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down her face. She had fought so hard to get to this moment, but now that it was here, she could barely breathe. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man with a confident smirk, stood up to cross-examine Marcus. He began with simple questions, trying to poke holes in the boy's story. But Marcus held his ground, his voice steady even as his hands shook. And then, just as the attorney was about to sit down, something unexpected happened. A piece of evidence was introduced, a piece of evidence that no one saw coming. It was a video, grainy and shaky, but clear enough to make out what was happening. The footage showed Marcus in the park, but it wasn't what the defense had hoped for. Instead of proving Marcus's guilt, it showed something entirely different. The room erupted into chaos as the video played, the gasps and murmurs growing louder with each passing second. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but it was too late. The damage had been done. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the screen went black. The video cut off, leaving everyone in the room staring at a blank screen, their minds racing with questions. What had just happened? What did the video show? And most importantly, what did it mean for Marcus's case? The judge called for a recess, and the courtroom emptied, but the questions lingered unanswered. Marcus and his mother left the room, their faces a mix of hope and fear. The defense attorney looked shaken, his confidence wavering for the first time. And the prosecution? They were smiling, but it was a cautious smile. the kind that says they know something big is about to happen. As the doors closed behind them, one thing was clear. This case was far from over. The real shock was still to come, and when it did, it would change everything. But for now, all anyone could do was wait and wonder what would happen next. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of what had just unfolded lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Marcus and his mother, Linda, stepped into the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Linda's arm was wrapped tightly around her son's shoulders, her face a mask of determination, but her eyes betrayed the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Marcus, still clutching the small stuffed bear he'd brought for comfort, looked up at her. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you think they believe me now?" Linda squeezed him tighter, her heart breaking at the uncertainty in his voice. "We're not done yet, baby," she said softly. "But they're starting to see the truth. Just hold on a little longer." The truth, however, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. To understand how Marcus ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back to the beginning, to the day that changed everything. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that makes you want to stay outside forever. Marcus had just finished shooting hoops with his friends at the park. He was laughing, joking, and enjoying the kind of carefree happiness that only a kid can feel. But as he started his walk home, he noticed a police cruiser slowly following him. At first, he didn't think much of it. He wasn't doing anything wrong after all. But then the cruiser stopped, and two officers stepped out. Officer Daniels and Officer Harris were well known in the town. Daniels, the older of the two, had a reputation for being tough but fair. Harris, on the other hand, was newer to the force, and some people said he had a chip on his shoulder. They approached Marcus, their expressions unreadable behind their sunglasses. "Hey, kid," Daniels said, his voice calm but firm. "We got a call about someone matching your description causing trouble around here. You know anything about that?" Marcus shook his head, confused. "No, sir," he said. "I was just playing basketball with my friends. I'm heading home now." The officers exchanged a glance, and then Harris stepped closer. "Mind if we take a look in your bag?" he asked, nodding toward the backpack Marcus was carrying. Marcus hesitated. He didn't have anything to hide, but something about the way Harris was looking at him made him nervous. I guess," he said, slowly sliding the bag off his shoulders. But as he handed it over, Harris grabbed his arm, his grip tighter than necessary. "Hey!" Marcus yelped, trying to pull away. "Let go!" What happened next was a blur. Marcus remembered shouting, the officers yelling back, and then a sudden sharp pain as he was pushed to the ground. He tried to get up, but someone, he wasn't sure who, pinned him down. He felt a knee in his back, his arm twisted behind him, and then the sound of a voice he'd never forget. "Stop resisting, kid." The words were loud, angry, and they didn't make sense. He wasn't resisting. He was just scared. By the time it was over, Marcus was lying on the ground, his arm throbbing, his face wet with tears. The officers stood over him, their breathing heavy. "You're lucky we're letting you off with a warning," Daniel said, tossing Marcus's bag back at him. "Next time, think twice before causing trouble." And with that, they got back in their cruiser and drove away, leaving Marcus alone, hurt and terrified. He didn't know what to do, he just wanted to go home. But when he got there, his mother took one look at him and knew something was terribly wrong. Linda Johnson was no stranger to hardship. A single mother working 2 jobs, she had always done her best to shield Marcus from the harsh realities of the world. But when she saw her son's bruised face and broken arm, something inside her snapped. She demanded answers, but the police department's response only made things worse. They claimed Marcus had been aggressive, that he had resisted arrest, and that the officers had acted in self-defense. Linda didn't believe it for a second. She knew her son. He was a good kid, a little rambunctious sometimes, but never violent. And so, she decided to fight. She hired a lawyer, filed a complaint, and vowed to do whatever it took to get justice for Marcus. The case quickly became a lightning rod for controversy. On one side were those who believed Marcus and Linda, who saw the incident as yet another example of police brutality and systemic injustice. On the other side were those who defended the officers, arguing that they were just doing their jobs and that Marcus must have done something to provoke them. The town was divided, and tensions were running high. Protests erupted outside the police station, with people holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End police brutality." Counter-protesters showed up too, chanting "Back the Blue" and accusing Marcus and his mother of lying. It was a mess, and it seemed like no one could agree on what had really happened. But then, the video surfaced. It was shaky and grainy, filmed on a cell phone by someone who had been walking their dog in the park that day. The footage didn't show everything, but it showed enough. It showed Marcus standing there, his hands at his sides, looking confused and scared. It showed the officers approaching him, their body language aggressive. And it showed the moment Marcus was pushed to the ground, his cries for help echoing in the background. The video didn't lie. It couldn't. And when it was played in court, it changed everything, or at least it seemed to. Because just as the video reached its most critical moment, the moment that could have proven Marcus's innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt, it cut off. The screen went black and the courtroom was left in stunned silence. What happened next? What did the video show? And why did it stop so abruptly? These were the questions on everyone's minds, as the judge called for a recess. But for Marcus and Linda, the questions were even more personal. Was this their chance to finally be heard, or was it just another twist in a story that seemed determined to keep them from the truth? As they waited in the hallway, Linda couldn't help but think about how far they'd come, and how much further they still had to go. She looked down at Marcus, his small frame leaning against her, and felt a surge of protectiveness. She would do whatever it took to keep him safe, to make sure his voice was heard. But she also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The officers had powerful allies, and the system wasn't always kind to people like them. Still, she refused to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Meanwhile, across the hall, Officer Daniels and Officer Harris were huddled with their lawyer, their faces tense. The video had shaken them, and they knew it. But they also knew that the fight wasn't over. They had their own version of events, their own evidence, and they were determined to use it. "We just need to stick to the story," their lawyer said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let them win." Daniels nodded, but Harris looked less sure. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe even guilt. But he didn't say anything. He just clenched his fists and looked away. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the hallway grew thicker. Everyone was waiting, waiting for the judge, waiting for the next piece of evidence, waiting for the truth to finally come out. But the truth, as it often does, was more complicated than anyone realized. And as the doors to the courtroom finally opened, signaling the end of the recess, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. And no one, not Marcus, not Linda, not the officers, was ready for what was coming next. The courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff's voice cut through the heavy silence. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Reynolds." The room shuffled to its feet, the tension so thick it felt like you could reach out and touch it. Marcus clung to his mother's hand as they made their way back to their seats. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Linda gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, but her own nerves were frayed. She glanced over at the defense table where the two officers sat with their lawyer. Officer Daniels looked calm, almost too calm, while Officer Harris kept fidgeting with his tie, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for an escape. Linda couldn't help but wonder what was going through their minds. Did they feel guilty? Were they scared? Or were they just confident they could win? The judge took his seat and adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Counsel," he said, looking at the prosecution, "you may proceed." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Sarah Collins, stood up and walked to the center of the room. She had a reputation for being relentless, and today was no exception. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but firm. We'd like to revisit the video evidence that was introduced earlier. As you saw, the footage clearly shows my client, Marcus Johnson, being approached by the defendants in a manner that can only be described as aggressive. It also shows him being forcibly restrained, despite posing no visible threat. However, the video was cut off prematurely, and we believe the full footage will shed even more light on what truly happened. That day, the defense attorney, a slick man named Robert Hayes, was on his feet before she could finish. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his tone dripping with confidence. "The prosecution is speculating. We have no way of knowing what the rest of the video contains, and introducing incomplete evidence is highly prejudicial." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the argument. "Overruled," he said finally. "But proceed with caution, Ms. Collins. I won't tolerate any attempts to mislead the jury." Sarah nodded, her expression unflinching. "Thank you, Your Honor. We'd like to call our next witness to the stand." The witness was a man named Carl Thompson, the person who had filmed the video. He was in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and a nervous demeanor. As he took the stand, he kept glancing at the officers, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah approached him, her tone gentle but probing. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell us what you saw on the day in question?" Carl cleared his throat and nodded. "I was walking my dog in the park when I saw the officers approach the boy. He looked scared, like he didn't know what was going on. I started filming because it didn't seem right. The way they were talking to him, the way they grabbed him, it just didn't sit well with me." Sarah nodded, encouraging him to continue. "And what happened after that?" Carl hesitated, his eyes flicking to Marcus. They pushed him down. He was crying, saying he didn't do anything wrong. I kept filming, but then one of the officers saw me and told me to stop. I didn't want any trouble, so I turned off the camera and left." The room was silent as Carl's words sank in. Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to request that Mr. Thompson's phone be examined to recover the full video. We believe it will provide crucial evidence in this case." Robert Hayes was on his feet again, his face red with frustration. "Objection. This is a fishing expedition, Your Honor. There's no guarantee the full video even exists, and even if it does, it's irrelevant. My clients were acting within their duties as law enforcement officers." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "I'll allow it," he said. "But if the video cannot be recovered, this line of questioning ends here." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "Understood, Your Honor." As the tech expert was called to the stand to examine Carl's phone, the tension in the room grew even thicker. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. He kept replaying that day in his mind, the fear and pain still fresh. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a small, reassuring smile, but even she looked worried. They both knew how much was riding on this. If the full video didn't show what they hoped it would, their case could fall apart. Meanwhile, Officer Harris was growing, more visibly agitated. He leaned over to Daniels and whispered, "What if the video shows everything? What if they see?" Daniels cut him off with a sharp look. "Keep it together," he muttered. "We stick to the story, no matter what." But Harris didn't look convinced. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. He kept glancing at Marcus, his expression unreadable. Was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely? As the tech expert worked on recovering the video, the courtroom waited in tense silence. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the expert looked up. "I've recovered the full video," he said. The room erupted into murmurs, but the judge quickly silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Play it," he ordered. The lights dimmed and the screen lit up. The video began where the previous one had left off, but this time, it kept going. The footage showed Marcus on the ground, crying out in pain as the officers pinned him down. And then, just as it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, a new figure entered the frame. It was a woman, her face blurred but her voice clear as she shouted, "Stop! You're hurting him!" The officers turned, their expressions darkening. and then the video cut off again. The room was in chaos. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but it was no use. Marcus felt like the walls were closing in. Who was the woman? What had she seen? And why had the video stopped there? Linda was on her feet, her face pale. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "We need to find that woman. She could be the key to proving my son's innocence." The judge nodded, his expression grim. "I'll issue a subpoena for her to come forward. But until then, we're adjourned for the day." As the courtroom emptied, Marcus and Linda stepped outside into the fading sunlight. The day had been exhausting, but they knew the fight was far from over. Across the street, the officers were getting into their car, their faces tense. Harris glanced back at Marcus, his expression unreadable, before climbing into the passenger seat. Daniel started the engine and drove off, leaving Marcus and Linda standing there, their minds racing with questions. Who was the woman in the video? What had she seen? And what would happen when she finally came forward? The answers were out there, but for now all they could do was wait. And as they walked home, hand in hand, one thing was clear. The real battle was just beginning. The truth was closer than ever, but so were the dangers. And no one, not Marcus, not Linda, not the officers, was ready for what was coming next.